The two biggest teams in the Marvel Universe are pitted against one another, but is it a recipe for success, or just civil war under a different name? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Bendis, Fraction, Aaron, Brubaker and Hickman, and illustrated by Cho, Romita Jr., Copiel and Kubert. The first official issue of Avengers vs X-Men was published by Marvel Comics in April of 2012, with the 12th and final issue being published in December of the same year. And the Phoenix Force is back, with the X-Men believing this signals rebirth for mutant kind, and the Avengers remembering just how destructive of a force this is. War ensues, and no one's left on the sidelines. But what happens when the line between good and evil and right and wrong is blurred? And can either team make a decisive enough move to prevent destruction across the planet? It's such a weird trip when it comes to the art. I've made it no secret that I'm not the biggest fan of John Romita Jr.'s modern style, but his Daredevil stuff still bangs. But the one thing that I always knew about him was that he can bring his art out consistently. So when I got to issue 1, I wasn't thrilled to see that it was him on the title, but I knew that it could probably be him throughout the entire thing. But halfway through, you've got Copiel and Kubert taking over, and it's definitely stepped up a notch, so it's weird that I got the thing that I didn't think that I would get, but I was happier for it. And the more confusing thing for me, because I haven't read this since it was originally coming out in single issues, is that issue 0 was illustrated by Frank Cho. So I thought that he was going to be the lead for the entire series, and I had high hopes, no pun intended. And this gave me such a sleek, classic, yet polished vibe, reminiscent in many ways of Stuart Immonen, and just a few pages in we get I'll be back in a minute. But just touching on Romita Jr., I really can't fault the guy's work ethic. The dude's definitely a legend and I can't take that away from him, but there was definitely a turning point during his career, and Avengers vs X-Men came out during that time. His art's overly 2D and flat, and all of his characters look like they're based off 70s Star Wars toys. The arms just always seem to move in this way. Nothing ever feels proportional either, and the depth of field just always feels off. Because there's parts in this book where it looks like a puppet show. And this is a minor nitpick, but everybody's just always got the same mouth, and they're always grimacing, but they've always got the same perfect white teeth. And the biggest fault of this, especially when it comes to this title, is that action has no weight. A character can be blasted by Cyclops at point blank range, but it's got the same impact as if a gust of wind hit them. And don't get me wrong, there are moments of greatness that are scattered in between all of these criticisms, where his expression and composition could be up there with some of the best, but unfortunately they're just few and far between. And to give him credit, when I was looking at his wide shots, or we got landscapes or aircraft, or just some of the bigger moments, these are always great. And he does energy stuff great as well. When he's showing the Phoenix Force, you've just got this sense of magnitude. And if an attack affects an entire city, there's a great sense of impact. Or even when he's just doing a big spider web, but that one really shouldn't come as a surprise. And with him being able to do those bigger moments so well, it just surprises me that it doesn't translate to the small scale. I've also heard the argument in the past that it depends on who's doing the colouring, and that might be true. It's constant that it feels like there's missing shading, and that might be the reason why his positions always just look weird. But damn, as soon as it hits a halfway mark and Copiel takes over, it really steps it up. We're in Utopia, everything feels so vast and detailed. Magneto's helmet's shiny, Colossus is shiny, and yeah, I still get distracted by that kind of thing. All of his characters were textbook as well. It was great to see him doing work on Thor again, there was montages and group shots, and a lot of my nitpicks that I had during my House of M review were solved here. And this was also where the action was at its best. The fights were more widespread than just whoever was in the foreground. The landscape switched up so often that it always felt fresh, and it's just what I come to expect with a title like this. However, it is switched out for a couple of issues with Kubert, and the change isn't that jarring. And what I liked best about Kubert was his paneling. It was so dynamic, and no two pages looked the same, and it just looked like he left everything on the page. The only criticism that I've got is there was one double page spread where the perspective just really messed with my brain, which isn't really that difficult, but still. You had characters in weird positions that you feel like they shouldn't have been, and they were all looking like they were the exact same distance away from each other. And there is also something about his style that just reminds me of 90s art, but I really can't put my finger on it. So the art definitely got more exciting for me the longer that this book went on, which is great because sometimes a book can fizzle out towards the end. And regardless of who was doing the art, the action at bare minimum was always engaging, which is the key component for something like Avengers vs X-Men. Versus also had a variety of great artists as well. There's a lot that I really did enjoy, and if I had to pick my favourite, I'd probably go with the one from Daredevil vs Psylocke. This just always looked phenomenal. There was so much detail, but there were so many artists that worked picked on this tie-in series that I could probably do an entirely separate video. You might have a different favourite than me, and it's something that you can compare in the upcoming Omnibus, which you can already order from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Now, let's not beat around the bush. This event was dumb, and it was also exactly what I needed. It tries its hardest to act like it's this deep, emotional, universe-spanning event that's going to have lasting repercussions for years to come, but the only real people that this had any impact on was the X-Men. In all honesty, this event should have just been called Marvel vs. X-Men because that's pretty much all it became. And I actually enjoyed this more now, reading it 10 years after it came out, than when it was originally coming out in single issues. And that's mostly because of the fact that anything that did have an impact in this series has already pretty much been written out. And the strange thing is that it's kind of the best of both worlds. If you want a story with a structured beginning, middle, and end, then it is here, and it's also entertaining, even if a lot of the character motivations just don't add up. But if you also wanted the comic book equivalent of emptying out your toy box when you're a kid, or maybe when you're a grown adult and you're still buying them like I am, and making random heroes fight even if it didn't make much sense, then there's an entire spin-off tie-in series that's just called Versus. And this acted as a really nice break from the main event, but I do also think it's essential to this reading. It just had matchups that were fun and dumb, and even from the introduction page in each issue, it's very clear that this isn't taking itself seriously. And one of the issues that I had is that halfway through Versus, it seems like they just give up because they don't tell you where that issue is placed within the main event. It is something that I'm hoping that the Omnibus solves, and I did read this on the Marvel Unlimited app, even though I've got the hardcover here, and it's got a reading order, but all it does is categorize it by series instead of where you're supposed to read each issue. It's interesting though, because I picked this up just because I fancied reading it, but it acts like a bookend to House of M. We pick up and Scarlet Witch is back, and the world still hasn't forgiven her, or the heroes still don't trust her. This plotline is laid on quite thick in the final issue, but at its core it remains focused on the main thing, the Avengers vs the X-Men. Speaking of which, this book delivers on its title. The group fights in this were great, especially in the second half of the series when there's a greater sense of scope and perspective. However, the more interesting one-on-one fights were reserved for Versus, which is why I say that I feel like you have to read that title, which is a bit of a shame because besides Wolverine vs Captain America in one of the early issues, the main fights that I remember come from Versus, and it kind of overshadows the main event a little bit if you're just looking for an action-packed fight. And that isn't necessarily a negative because Versus really did need a selling point, and I could easily jump between the two series, but it just highlighted one of the major problems with this overall event. There are massive gaps in the main story. Issue 2 ends with the cliffhanger of Thor and the Secret Avengers preparing to fight in space, and then this is picked up in issue 4 and the battle's already over. I get it, event comics need to allow openings so that other series that are connected can pick up the story elsewhere, but it should never have a negative impact on the main title, or it should be like something like Annihilation and make sure that all those separate series are essential reads and included the entire time. Because my favourite events are the ones where I could just read the main series and still get a full story, but every tie-in that I read helps enhance the experience. To add to that, each issue starts with a breakdown of where every character is, and I couldn't remember what half of these people had done. I remember the big moments, but there was times when a character would jump between the two teams, and it feels like that should be an important moment, but it just wasn't. Sometimes it wouldn't even get a mention, and it'd just be like nothing's happened. This also could just be because of the sheer numbers of characters that are in this, and it did make sure that it zeroed in its focus on a few of them, and it managed to do a surprisingly good job at showing the impact that this would have on some of the established relationships. They were placed in direct conflict with each other, and it was really nice to see, and I wish that was something that could have been explored more with other characters. What's best about the Black Panther and Storm bit was, even when the road was less bumpy, it still kept their relationship strained. They couldn't just forget what had happened, the fact that they were fighting each other, and it made me want to see where it picks up after this event, because this was one of the plot elements that I found most interesting, and I wish they would have gone further with Wolverine. In this book, he is an Avenger, but at heart he's always going to be a part of the X-Men, yet there's only a few moments where they really highlight the struggle that he's going through. Again, I don't know if I need to read about 5 or so spin-off issues, but I didn't get it in this main event, and arguably that could have been the perfect emotional core for this story. Now, this is a 12-issue event, and there's a lot going on, so it might be easy to forget something, or especially some of those smaller moments, but Thor punches a kid in this. and I'm okay with that. Another thing that I was disappointed with was Iron Man sitting most of this out. His best fight was arguably in the first issue of Versus, which takes place in issue 2 of the main event. And he does have a real big impactful moment at the end, but he was one of the characters that I was most excited to see in this, and I couldn't remember a lot of what he'd done from when I read this 10 years ago, and I think the reason is because he didn't do a lot. It would have been interesting to see how he'd changed since Civil War, especially since this was only shortly after Siege, so the Avengers were only really just coming back together, and him once again being in a fight against some of his friends, some of the people that he respects most, could have been really interesting for this story, and I feel like it's a massive missed opportunity to just pretty much have him mooching about. Also, you might already know, but I'm a Power Rangers kid at heart, so dumb armor, sign me up. So it pains me to say this, but I hated the flying tactical gear in issue 6. What was the point in this? Why did the shield need protection? This book also came out in that weird time where companies were just trying to figure out how they can incorporate iPads and iPhones into everything. So there's these infinite issues that are shoved in here and there that are pretty much the equivalent of when you were a kid and you'd get like a wad of post-it notes and you'd draw something in the top corner so that you could flip it through and have some kind of sort of moving story. And it just slowed the book down, so after the first couple I got quite bored and I kept skipping these. Another thing, I wasn't a massive fan of Hope. Like, I didn't dislike it, but this book really forces you to care. A large part of this event is pretty much just to capture the flag task, but instead of a flag it's an actual person, but she only became vital in the final issue, and I think they just spent so much time focused on her and the teams reacting to her where they could have cut all that down a little bit and had some more interesting fights in the main event. In saying that, considering the name of this book, we don't really spend a lot of time with the X-Men. We got a bit in the middle when something happens that changes the dynamic that I can't really say in here without getting into spoilers, but I just wanted more Colossus. And that brings me on to my biggest disappointment with this title, is that I really thought it was going to be more balanced. I wanted to be put in a position where I didn't side with either the X-Men or the Avengers, and I could see where both of them are coming from. And when it kicked off, it seemed like they both had a really good argument for why they were standing the ground. But the longer that this title went on, it was clear that we were being forced to side with the Avengers. Sure, yes, it's probably because it was released in 2012 at the same time when the first movie was coming out, but it's just a shame because in the couple years before this, Mutant kinda just lost so much. It had been years since House of M, but it's clear that there's still a lasting effect. And this was the first glimmer of hope that they'd had for a while. Again, no pun intended. But the X-Men and Cyclops in particular took things so far that I couldn't get behind them. And it was clear that the Avengers needed to be the one to save the day and stop them. And I just feel like with so many different writers coming from a variety of different titles and understanding these characters from different angles, it could have been more nuanced and not so one-sided, which I think is integral when you've got two heroes being pitted against each other. And the ending arc itself felt quite big and grand scale, which was needed for a title like this, but the actual 12th and final issue just felt a bit meh. There's way too much flashback in this, it goes a little bit too far over in the deep end, and the resolution itself feels like a slap in the face to everyone but two characters. And it's disappointing because a character gets reintroduced, someone that we hadn't seen throughout this main event, you know, an integral Avengers member, but then that character does nothing of any major significance. They don't give them that big payoff or a real explanation why they needed to come in this late into the story. So it almost feels a bit pointless bringing them back. In saying that, the overall build up throughout the series was great, and it feels like this could have been one of those titles that just blows its load really early on, especially because of the fact that the X-Men and the Avengers fight each other in issue 2. And for as silly as the plot was, it did gradually build, there were really interesting twists and developments, and there weren't many moments where I had an opportunity to be bored, and just overall the pace was worked out really well. Conversations didn't dominate the action, and there wasn't so many fights that I forgot what the plot was, and it's weird seeing this get such a bad rap since it was released. I don't really hear a lot of people talking about this with any kind of acclaim. Like, yeah, it's not the greatest event ever, and it does have its shortcomings, but unfortunately most of those shortcomings are actually spoilers. So this is your final spoiler warning. If you don't want anything ruined, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict, but I hated what they did to Cyclops. When it gets to the stage that Magneto's saying that you've gone a bit too far, maybe you need to rein it in. And it is just a shame because it felt so out of character for Cyclops to just forget what the Phoenix Force could really do, and at a certain point it became Avengers and X-Men vs Cyclops. And I can't lie, Cyclops is the least intimidating dude. Like, of all time, even over somebody like Jimmy Olsen. Even with the visor I wouldn't be afraid to fight him, but if it was somebody like Colossus, well, I'd still fight him, but less confidently. So I wish this event could have found a way of developing its story without needing to push Cyclops under the bus and making him the big bad of the entire thing. On top of that, I also hated Cyclops killing Xavier. I get that the Phoenix had taken over him and we saw what that had done to Jean Grey, but this just still felt like one step just way too far. And what's worse is that they doubled down once the Phoenix Force left. In that final face-to-face with Captain America and Wolverine, he was still talking like he did everything that he wanted to, at which point you can't just blame it on the Phoenix Force, and I feel like this is something that just completely ruins Cyclops. Okay, maybe that helps me understand why people don't like this event so much. And don't get me wrong, I liked the novelty of the Phoenix 5, I thought it was an interesting development. I liked how it also wasn't just an entirely negative thing, but we just didn't get a lot of time there to really see the positive impact that this Phoenix 5 could have before they all just started trying to get each other's powers, and I feel like there could have been a lot more story to explore there. And I said this in my House of M review, but I just love that no matter what happens, Hawkeye will always still be the guy that will point an arrow at anybody and isn't afraid to fire. And in my spoiler-free section, I talked about them having this big moment where a character was reintroduced, and of course I'm talking about Mr. Hulk. Yep, Mr. Bruce himself came back. He was in his cave of sadness, which kind of sounds like the place where I'm at in life. And the build-up to it was great, that you saw Captain America talking to somebody that wasn't in the panel, and I remember wondering who it was. Because we had Red Hulk throughout this, I remember him throughout Jeff Loeb's run, and I loved when I reviewed that, so I wasn't really yearning for him, but I was happy when it was revealed to be him. It's just a shame that, like I said, this didn't really turn the tide of anything. It still just became about Hope and Scarlet Witch finding a way to destroy the Phoenix Force, so it kind of feel like they just had that moment for fan service but didn't really know where they were going with it. And like I said about the ending, it was just those two characters coming together and everybody else felt pretty irrelevant. They'd put up a bit of a fight, and I'm sure that that did help to turn the tide a little bit, but from the very beginning you could have just had Hope and Scarlet Witch come together and it feels like nothing would have gone wrong. And like I said, I hated the amount of flashbacks that were in this final issue because you just saw them two arguing even though you knew that they were going to work together anyway. This is my final verdict, and sometimes the title of an event can promise more than the book can deliver. Something like Avengers vs X-Men would evoke a wide range of possibilities in any comic fan's mind, which is something that this book tries to live up to. I had a great time with it, but it does still fall short of the highs that were reached during House of M, because the plot that facilitates the battles takes the easy route of just making the mutants the enemies. Again, a good number of the exciting and key moments are in the tie-ins and neglected in the main event, and the art, although it does peak towards the end, starts off like it's just a bunch of unfinished pages. But first and foremost, comics are supposed to be a form of entertainment, and in the 10 years since AVX, the X-Men have been redeemed. A lot of the repercussions of this have been washed away by the countless events that have followed it, so at a base level and read outside of continuity, this is just a dumb, fun, blockbuster type of event that features the two biggest teams over at Marvel. It is pretty much just Civil War with a different name and different alliances, but I never feel like it's trying to take itself too seriously. So if you're okay with the X-Men being the bad guys and you just want a roller coaster ride, then this is definitely worth a read, but you have to make sure that you read the full thing. But for sheer entertainment value alone, I'm going to give this a decent enough score of 70%. Woof woof! So that's the video, and hopefully you enjoyed it, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.